Hey, what's up, friends? Welcome back to the Relationship Schools podcast here, where we help you be a smart human being, smart couple, smart individual. Grateful to be back here talking at you and having your ears bending to listen. Thanks. This podcast is all about long-term partnership and successful relationships in general. And we never got a class on this. And so this is your class. Okay, over and over again now. We've been going on 4 years here. Holy shit. Pretty cool. So thanks for supporting us along the way. If you haven't if you haven't left us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, etc., please do. It helps. Thanks. Okay, my guest today is Dr. Stephen Porges. Okay, this is a very dense one. Okay, for those neuroscience, nervous system geeks, this is very dense. But don't let that thwart you, okay? This podcast is all about facial expressions and what happens in the body and why it's so important to watch the tendency to misread other people, like I do. I misread people all the time. Because I'm sensitive. I see your flat affect. I see your furrowed brow. And people misread me all the time. It's just going on all the time. All right. And sometimes we make it about ourselves, as we talk about in this podcast. Okay. If you haven't listened to the first episode where we get more into the polyvagal theory and safety in relationships, please listen to that one. It's episode number 116. Okay, so you can just Google Jason Gaddis, Stephen Porges, Smart Couple 116, or you can just go to YouTube, same thing, type in Stephen Porges, Jason Gaddis, or it's on our website, relationshipschool.com/podcast 116. Okay, lots of ways to get there, these past episodes. And make sure you subscribe, by the way, to the podcast on your phone. Just hit subscribe so that way you get text messages when it pops up. Okay, Apple, that's how Apple podcasts work. It's great. All right, so Steve and I dig into a lot of stuff. The nervous system and the face specifically. We get into sympathetic versus parasympathetic arousal. We get into if you're a caretaker or a caregiver to someone in your life, you're going to want to stay tuned to the very end because there's some really enlightening stuff there about why you might burn out. And we talk about the fight, flight, quote, freeze response and some of the more subtleties. It's not that simple, guys, as I continue to learn. We even talk about depression, being with a depressed partner. All right. Okay. So I think you're going to dig this. There's a lot of layers in this one. Definitely do not listen to this at 1.5 speed. Listen to it at normal speed, guys. Maybe listen twice for you science nerds, brain nerds like me. Okay? All right. Let's just dive in here and make sure you stay tuned to the action step at the end. All right. Welcome back, Steve Porges.
Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me back again.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, last time we talked about sort of the neuroscience and power of safe relationships, and I want to go a little further today. And listeners, for the listener here, if you haven't heard that podcast, it's 116. And it was really cool what we got into. So we're going to go a little further. All right. Kind of just to set context, Steve, I'd love to make this relevant for the listener. This is a relationship podcast. And last time we talked a little bit about facial expressions, which I think is something huge here, kind of body language and face and what happens in the body when we misinterpret, et cetera. So let's use just kind of a hypothetical example of why this might be relevant for the listener. Let's say you and I are in a relationship. Why should what we're about to talk about matter to the listener?
Well, what we'll start learning from our discussion is it's not the words that really matter so much in the relationship. It's really the contingency of how we interact with each other. I was actually listening to a song when recently. There's a song that Alison Krauss sings when there's nothing to say. She didn't write it, but it's really a polyvagal song because it says you don't have to say things to know that you're in someone's heart or you're with someone, because it's the contingency of the facial expressivity that our body responds to. So it's easier for the listener to see the disruption, the ruptures, than to see the good part. So it's really kind of, our nervous system picks up the ruptures and not necessarily very good with the repairs. So with the ruptures, I'm talking to you and, I'm telling you about, I have this real sadness, something happened to me. And you turn and look at your iPhone, or you turn to look at the clock, or you say, I got to go now. You are rupturing a moment where the person is reaching for you. And I call this biological rudeness because we know what it is. It's when we turn away and when we don't get the contingent. And this word contingency means I give you a behavior. I expect a reciprocal behavior to come back within a time window, so which my nervous system can tolerate. So if you're saying I'm leaving now and the person's head is still down on the laptop or wherever, and you stand there waiting for the person to acknowledge that you said you're leaving, how long can you stand there before your body starts saying, well, I'm not even part of this person's life?
Yeah, totally.
But it becomes even worse when we start depending on these devices, because we now text, and our nervous system didn't, even though texting has a lag, our nervous system didn't evolve to have a lag of testing, am I safe with that interaction? So you send a text. How long can you tolerate waiting to get a response before you start feeling uncomfortable, either concerned about the safety and welfare of the other person, or about how that person is now making you feel? Now, those physiological shifts are powerful, and they kind of drive our personal narrative. And now we put words to those feelings, and often those words are not loving or engaging or supportive words. They're either fear-based or hurt-based.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just thinking of kind of once in a while, if I'm working in the morning and my wife wakes up later than me, which is often the case, and I'm on my computer in the kitchen and she comes in and she says, hey, good morning. And I don't look up, right? It's like there's a matter of time before now we're in kind of a stressful situation because I'm not turning toward her and saying, hey, honey, hey, good morning. I'm like sucked into I'm distracted into my work, right?
But it becomes even more, I wouldn't say complicated, but more vicious in the cycle. So once you're stuck in there, your lack of responding to her changes her state, and now her interactions with you are not as supportive or being present to where you are. Because if you said, good morning, dear, I'm a little bit pressed now because I have to do something in a few minutes, please excuse me, then...
Right, she'd calm down maybe, yeah.
Maybe. The issue is you start using these higher level narratives of explanation that enable you to be more resilient and buffered of your spouse's or partner's responses.
Yeah.
So while you're working or anxious to do something, in your mind you say, you're assuming that she understands that your intentions are good, you're trying to do something for the family unit or for your success as a unit, and that's implicit in what you're doing. That's not necessarily what her body's reading.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, for the listener, this is essential, I think, for us because these sort of micro adjustments in our face and how we respond to each other are happening throughout the day, right? And it can be, as you said, in through text. Like if we don't hear back in a certain amount of time, might signal a threat response, right?
Well, let's put the threat word away and let's say we may become defensive.
Okay.
So it's not like someone's going to hurt us, but we may become defensive because that person is no longer supporting us. So now our body has to take care of itself. What we have in relationships is this ability to co-regulate, in a sense, to give up some of the responsibility of taking care of ourselves because we know that the other is there to support us. Mm-hmm. And that enables us to be more available. But in that accessibility state, we are also more vulnerable.
Yeah.
And when you text and don't get a response, you're saying, I'm accessible. And now you get pissed off for being accessible because you became vulnerable because the person wasn't functionally respecting the fact that you had made yourself accessible, which is being vulnerable.
Yeah.
So you didn't respect that. And that's what I call biological rudeness.
Okay. But biological rudeness has its roots in the biology of our nervous system.
Yes.
And the way I understand it is the vagus and our social engagement system is the newest adaptation of the nervous system that connects the heart and the brain.
Yeah.
And it's all about the face, right? It's like so
Well,
much of it's about the facial expressions.
let's kind of partition this and say it's a newest innervation of the neuroregulation of our autonomic nervous system. It's how we regulate our body and how our body impacts on our perceptions of the world and the way we react to others. So the powerful part of this newer circuit is what I call basically an integrated social engagement system. But I want you to think of that system as having its control features in the brain. So the brain is literally controlling. The vagus is merely a highway, a wire that is providing information to our body, our viscera, our heart primarily, to calm down or to get mobilized.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sending cues down to calm us down, or sending cues upward from the heart to the brain saying, my body feels threatened. I don't feel safe. Now, what we do with that information requires, in a sense, a type of sophistication of our own understanding of our own bodily cues. Once we feel those things, we don't always have to act them out. We can say, well, I'm a little irritable now. Maybe I want to put my body, move it
Mm-hmm.
to a quiet, safe place where I can have a few moments to take a few deep breaths to calm down. And the taking of deep breaths and slowly exhaling is actually a neurophysiological way of triggering more vagal influence on the heart. So it downregulates those defenses. So even in our metaphors, take a deep breath, which no one wants to be told when they get worked up.
Yeah.
But if we come about that on our own and say, well, maybe I need to come into a room by myself, do a little breathing, calm down, relax, basically we have all kinds of metaphors, let things flow out of us or flow through us. And in a way, that's how we are when we're not in a state of defense. When in a state of defense, we're holding on to everything. Everything's tense.
Yeah.
So the face is critical in the evolution of mammals. What the face gave the mammal was a way of conveying their physiological state to a member of their species. And they do that. We do it a lot in the primates with facial expressivity, but with more primitive mammals, it was vocalizations. And we still do it with vocalization. So in relationships, it's probably much more important about how your voice sounds than what it's saying.
Mm-hmm. Totally. The tone, the pitch.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Are we there? So look at a baby, or what I now like to talk about is how do we treat our dogs?
Yeah.
And the reason I make that statement is men are very comfortable with kind of using a pet ease or a higher pitched melodic voice with their dogs, but they're much more resistant to doing that with their kids or their spouses.
Mm-hmm.
But mothers, it's so intuitive to a mother. So a mother's lullaby, a mother's intonation of what do you do with a baby who's crying? You can see those cues, those intonations of the mother's lullaby or voice are functionally the distilled essence of safety.
Yeah.
Because the baby's nervous system takes that intonation and says, I'm safe. I don't have to be defensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's really incredible. Can you there's many things I want to unpack here. So it sounds to me like you use the word defensive, I use the word threat, and then you use the word threat again in terms of, to me, it feels, I think I've heard you say this before, it's a threat detection system. Is that fair?
Yeah.
We're looking for, is this life-threatening? Is this dangerous? Or is this safe?
It's a risk. I actually would say it's a risk because that risk detection system can say it's safe.
Right.
So it's a continuum of risk that our nervous system is continuously evaluating. And there are a lot of people who, when they get into a social interaction, will say, I just don't feel comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that the person isn't physically attractive or doesn't have the features that they may like, but they just don't feel comfortable. Now, that's really, is their body feeling safe in the presence of the other? Is the body able to give up its defenses and become accessible and vulnerable? So we have this kind of balance of vulnerability versus accessibility. And the social engagement system allows you to move along that continuum.
Yeah. Yeah, you talked about, I've listened to a number of interviews with you. You talk about the nervous system functioning in a hierarchical way,
Yeah.
and that we are aware of the body responses, but not the cues. Will you unpack that? Because this feels really important.
The cues that trigger us into states of defense occur so rapidly that they're out of the realm of our awareness or consciousness.
And what you call neuroception.
Neuroception. I had to, in a sense, create the word because I wanted to use perception, but now we get into this cloudy area of awareness and cognition and intentionality. And then people start getting angry at themselves that why didn't they respond to that when they get hurt or endangered?
Mm-hmm.
Our body reacts very quickly to threat sounds, like someone screaming or someone hitting the brakes or something falling, long before we have a moment even to interpret what it is.
Yeah.
So what I am saying is that our body reacts and we don't know where the cues or what the stimuli are. We don't really know its risk value, but we feel our body and we're aware of that. So we have a much more reliable system of interoception
Mm-hmm.
of our bodily feelings.
Which is interoception. Will you just explain that real quick for the listener?
It's the nervous system's ability to monitor itself, to feel itself. So we call it feelings. I feel this way. I have a gut feeling.
Mm-hmm.
What that is saying is, it's a interoception. So the feedback from your gut is affecting, you're getting that information. People will feel palpitations in their heart. They'll say, now how do they know that they're getting that? That's all interoception.
Yeah.
They're feeling that. And some people, when they get really, really upset, the heart just pounds and the body literally shakes from that.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
They know that.
Yeah.
And they try to interpret it. But what I think the critical point is, what narrative do we make with that information of our interoception? What narrative do we make when we become aware of our bodily feelings? And I think that's where we get into a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying, on that point, we need to say, I'm feeling something. I respect that I'm feeling that, but I can't attribute the cause to that immediately. I need to use higher brain structures to evaluate that before I create this stubborn, functioning narrative that's blaming you.
Yeah, totally.
And this is the relationship. And if we're talking about relationship, every relationship has arguments because the other person is unaware of the bodily feelings that they've triggered in the other.
Yeah.
And they're trying to create a narrative that justifies what they've done. And my latest comment is that there is no such thing as an argument because they cannot be won. They just create problems. Because all they do is ramp up people's physiological states. So they lose the capacity to have compassion and awareness of the other.
Yeah.
And it's all about what narrative they can use to justify their behavior. And in their narrative, make them into good people. So if you think about what arguments are about, they're all about the intention. And the issue is, in most cases, the intention is irrelevant. The damage has occurred, and we now need to repair that and fix that. And that's what relationships are for. They evolve in our species and in all mammalian species as a way of repairing disruptions.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's use an example here. I walk into the kitchen, let's say, and my wife, for whatever reason, on a neuroceptive level, I'm picking up on something.
Yeah.
And then interoception happens and I start feeling something. And then on top of that, I make meaning out of what the feeling and the felt experience is, right? And I make the meaning, let's say, that she's mad at me.
Yeah.
And then I might say something like, honey, are you mad at me? And then that triggers her into, she was fine a second ago. And now she's like, what? Now she's on the defensive, perhaps.
Right. And she might have been just kind of daydreaming or thinking of a problem that she had to solve.
Yep.
And her face was blank and she was not really engaging you.
Yeah.
And we all go through that, but we try to make meaning out of what we're experiencing.
Yeah.
And when it's not a close relationship, we start interpreting it as people who don't like us.
Totally. Yeah, we make it about us. That's one of our favorite things to do as human beings.
Well, it's our narrative, because once we're no longer accessible or present or engaged in the state of co-regulating, it becomes all about us, because that we've recruited our defenses. And once we when you say a person's defensive, it's synonymous with saying it's all about them. It's all about the person. They have to protect themselves.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to de-escalate that, you acknowledge that. And you don't say it's all about you. Now, what about me? That just will ramp it up another level.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've heard, let's talk co-regulation for the listener here. You mentioned it a couple times, and I've heard other people call it interactive regulation. What do you mean by co-regulation?
Well, I kind of view it as part of our evolutionary heritage that mammals, when they were born, could not survive on their own. It's obvious when a baby is born. But this is the case with all mammals. So it meant that they needed to be co-regulated, which wasn't necessarily mean that they were being given to by one. So if you watch a mother with a baby, the mother is calming the baby, but the baby is also calming the mother. Mm-hmm. There is a bidirectionality. And that's this aspect of being a mammal that's really quite interesting, is that we use our social behavior, we use proximity with people that we feel comfortable with and safe as a way of regulating our physiology. And that's co-regulation. Now I bring this, I organize this to say, first we need to co-regulate. And we now, in our mind, have these wonderful images of being nurtured and cared for. And so even when that figure of co-regulation isn't in our physical world, they're in our mental world. Mm-hmm. And now we have the capacity to self-regulate because we have mental images that we can recruit to make us feel good.
Yeah, and a baby learns to self-regulate through the co-regulation.
Right. It's a process. So it's not like if you're always co-regulating, you're spoiling the person. You're giving the person a resource that will enable them to be resilient. And interestingly, with kids, if kids are well co-regulated, they become more exploratory.
Yeah, exactly. Safer to go out and explore and take risks.
And then they have some place to come back to become safe. And that co-regulation shifts from the physical co-regulation to a visual image of a historical co-regulation.
Yeah, so let's bring that into an adult partnership, because that's different than sort of a top-down, if you will, parent-child relationship. Mm-hmm. Now we're in a mutual relationship where we're spouses co-regulating mm-hmm. each other there. How does that, just for the listener, they're like, okay, co-regulation, I can see that basically I want to behave in a way that has my partner feel safe, and they want to behave in a way that has me feel safe so that we can go live our lives. Is that kind of what this is you're saying here?
Right, but you can actually take away the complexity and say, I want to be playful with my partner. Mm-hmm. Because play is all about co-regulation.
Yeah.
Play is also a lot of, play and humor have co-regulation and disruption and repair of co-regulation. So even humor, like the first bit the babies have with peekaboo.
Yeah.
That's a disruptor. That's a frightening experience, loss of contact with the mother. But by violating the expectancy and having a repair, it becomes humorous.
Totally.
It creates resilience. And likewise, when we play with our partners and we enjoy each other, then we start building resilience because the co-regulation is always there, even when it gets challenged.
What's the difference, Steve, between co-regulation and attunement?
They're probably pretty much, they're just different metaphors. So attunement, I wouldn't, since attunement was not really my theoretical orientation, but it's the notion of people really being able to read each other's cues and getting in, quote, sync with each other. Mm-hmm. So it is the process underneath the actual, I would say the functional neurobiological process underneath attunement would be co-regulation.
And is co-regulation then about being in sync? Like when we're in sync, more is possible in our life. And when we're out of sync, we need to do what we need to do to get in sync again.
So with co-regulation, you're, in my conceptualization, you're acknowledging that you're going to be out of sync a good portion of your time, mm-hmm. but you have the capacity or the resource to now become retuned or co-regulated. So it's an acknowledgement that the normal or typical life experience is to have co-regulation, but lots and lots of time where it's not there. It could be ruptures or demands that require self-regulation, but always having in background a resource to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
friendships, family. Um, that's the world we came from, and where community and family were part of that support system.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's use a hypothetical, another example here of, for some reason, I'm thinking of this middle school teacher I had that taught science. And he basically just talked at the students, and he had a fairly flat affect. And it's like a teacher not reading the audience, right? And they're all goofing off or checking out or doodling on their thing. And then there's, let's say, a great teacher who's extremely present, engaged, has the students completely enraptured in whatever the learning is. What's the difference there between like a teacher who has the capacity to connect with its audience or the students, and a teacher who is just sort of monologuing and has lost connection with the students and isn't reading facial expressions at all?
So there are two different theoretical positions being manifested in your examples. One is an intuitive understanding that how the child feels, how the student feels, their physiological state will literally open the gates of learning or close them.
Yeah.
So that the ability to process novel information and to make sense of it is really in part dependent upon their physiological state. So we use words like, I'm enjoying it. We use the word rapture, being pulled in. But it's really saying, if my physiological state feels so comfortable that I have a smile and I'm not hypervigilant looking behind me, I'm going to pick up a lot more information. Now, the other teacher is really the product of what is really, I would say, colleges of education, where they're very behaviorally oriented and course outlined oriented. You structure your lesson, you have lesson plans. There's little discussion about the physiological state of the child or the student or of the teacher. So it's very content oriented, and the notion is everything is about behavior. And even in education, they talk about special ed. Special ed is using behavioral technologies to rectify deficits in learning processes and behavioral problems.
Yeah.
And behavioral techniques in the regulation of behavioral problems isn't really the most efficient way, or there wouldn't be any hyperactivity or autism, or these features would have disappeared through the use of behavioral technologies. And what the behavioral technologies are doing, they're very good in creating rote-like behaviors.
Yeah. Not
very good in getting people to connect and feel comfortable with each other.
Yeah. Now, let's take it a next step and talk about public speaking for a minute. Something I struggle with, and I'm curious if you can relate to this, is let's say there's 200 people I'm speaking in front of, and the faces that I'm seeing, if I'm sensitive to facial expressions. So if I see flat affects on people, I get distracted and it can take me out. I can allow it to take me out. And then I have to I've got to be more interesting, or but sometimes people are just listening and they're very engaged and they're not smiling or whatever, because they're deeply contemplating something. But how would you recommend I or someone in my position work with like a group of people where you're potentially could misread people and then get taken out by that?
Yeah, well, I think very frequently you get taken out by, not being, it's a sense about being available. Now, for you on a personal level, you'd have to reflect on saying, what limits your accessibility to others? I mean, this would be a self-reflective moment, saying, why do you feel at times vulnerable in front of others?
Mm-hmm.
So so the idea is, can you get in front of people like you might with a friend having a beer, talking about things? Can you feel as open in that space, or let your body appear to feel that open?
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, you're doing a lecture or talking, so there are constraints on what you're going to say and do. But what the audience is looking for is listening to not only the information, which becomes very important, it gets them into the door, but the other part is whether can they connect with you? Do they feel comfortable with you? Now, people tend not, especially in the academic world, this is really not discussed that much about how do you feel with your professors, how do you feel in your classes. But in fact, at times, it works against professors when they get evaluated.
Yeah.
because they feel that they're just about making courses easy, and if people have,
Right.
more stern faces. So for me, I felt that over the years, I could convey much more information in my courses as I became more comfortable with students and with material. So it's all about how I felt
With
as a
people.
human being, and how I felt.
Yeah.
Did I feel vulnerable?
Yeah.
And the longevity does help, and many years doing the work. So once you feel that you know what there is to know in a given area, and if you get challenged, doesn't put you into defense, it puts you into a state of curiosity.
Yeah.
Because now it's all about, what do these questions, how do they help you expand your thinking process? So rather than saying, don't ask me that, or I'm concerned about what you ask me, having it open-ended for me is what makes interviews and talks much more interesting to me, because I get my mind working and I start to put these things together. But for me, it took a long time.
Yeah, practice.
And the other part is, when you're using yourself as an example, most of us, for a good portion of our lives, have to make a living. So how we are evaluated by others affects our ability to earn a living, to take care of our family, to fulfill our sense of our own personal expectations. As you get older and resources become less critical, and your kids have gone through college, and your parents have now transitioned, it changes.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of people, they never allow it to change, because they're still stuck as the 35-year-old, still trying to achieve, to take care of.
Sure.
And one has to always think about, when you're achieving, what can you use it for? How can you leverage that to expand your own sense of self, to be helpful to the others, to learn? So how can you leverage what you've done to do more, to be more knowledgeable and more helpful?
Hey guys, quick interruption from the Relationship School to remind you that time is running out to sign up for our 9-month training. All right, relationshipschool.com/DPIR. I think it's one of the greatest relationship courses on the planet, but don't take my word for it. Check out what Jess said.
My name is Jess. I'm from a tiny town in the mountains. I have been in DPIR since September, and then I actually did Jason's End Your Struggle with Him program. I had a pretty intense breakup. I had a fiance that left a couple weeks before the wedding, and I was already on a growth path, but that really just projected me into looking inward more. Really what I think I've learned the most is that it's so much about learning about myself. And of course it's learning about how to relate to other people and communicate and be respectful, but also just learning that it's okay for myself to have needs, to set boundaries with other people. I was kind of always a yes girl. So I think the biggest shift has been learning that in saying no to other people, it's actually saying yes to myself, which leaves me more empowered and able to show up even better for people I care about. It's funny because when I got the first program, it was like, End Your Struggle with Him. And I was like, oh, this is great. I'll learn about, how to fix things with my ex. And I was like, oh, no. Yeah, Jason's material is very confronting in a way that I really received well, because it really challenges you to realize that, you don't need to have a relationship to be okay with yourself. I was with a partner when I first started the course, and then we've since actually set some pretty healthy boundaries and just decided to take some time apart to do growth. We're still pretty good friends, so that's nice, and just kind of see how it unfolds from there.
Okay. Jess had an awesome time, and she's continuing on to train as a relationship coach. Relationshipschool.com/DPIR if you want to apply. All right, back to Stephen Porges. Just a slight turn here, just so, again, the listener has the context, and is what is the difference between the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system? Is there a difference?
Well, the central nervous system historically has been described as the brain and the spinal cord, and the nerves coming from those. And the autonomic nervous system has been treated as if it's a nervous system of visceral organs. There's a fallacy, because the nervous system treating the visceral organs, which has now been treated as below the neck, and therefore autonomic and not as important, is regulated in the brain as well. So it has a central nervous system component, except many people don't talk about it. So when you go to physicians for a visceral organ problem, you go to an internist, whether it's a cardiologist or a gastroenterologist, they think of the organ as the site of disorder and disease. They don't think of the nervous system that regulates those organs as creating the problem.
They're completely missing that. Yeah.
They're missing it. Now, you can have organ dysfunction, but often with organ dysfunction, the antecedent is an atypical neural regulation of that organ. So they're missing a more integrated concept, and they're also missing the importance of the sensory information from the organs to the brain. So you have, let's say, a gut issue that's going to affect how your brain functions. So rather than, it's a bidirectional one. So when we're, let's say, anxious for things, our gut gets turned off. But when we have gut problems, the information goes up to the brain as well. So the way I like to view it is that we have one nervous system, and we can partition it in different ways. There's an interesting, it's a Nobel Prize speech by, I can remember his first name. His last name is Hess, Hess.
Yeah.
Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1939. It's on the internet. You should read it. Everyone should read it because his Nobel Prize was on the basically the brain's regulation of our viscera, okay, the central regulation of visceral organs. And what he says in his opening paragraph is everything is connected to everything else. So it's almost this amazing from this most renowned scientist at that time, saying esoteric thought about interactions of systems as being interconnected is really how the body works.
Yeah. So cool. I mean, I think you sent me that article. I read about him in that article, the neurocardiology through the lens of polyvagal theory.
Yeah.
So are you saying that you treat him as one, and do you just say it's a dorsal and a ventral? Is that how you talk about it?
Well, when we start moving, so I treat the autonomic nervous system as merely being one aspect of our nervous system, but not distinct or unrelated to the central nervous system.
Okay.
So it's integrated. But when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we can talk about how that brainstem area, which is the major regulator of the autonomic nervous system, how it's organized. And then you can get into the issue of a dorsal and a ventral vagal center.
Okay.
And you can get into areas of the sympathetics that create mobilization and energy, not necessarily defense. We've been lost in this world of thinking the sympathetic is merely a fight-flight system. It's a system of enthusiasm and energy.
Uh-huh.
So we have to move it around. We have to be more understanding. And it's a system of enthusiasm and energy when it's contained with a social engagement system that says the world is safe for me.
Right.
Then it's enthusiastic and energetic. But if you lose that social engagement system function and the world is now dangerous, the sympathetics are part of your major defense, your initial defense.
Absolutely.
And then
you go ahead.
Then you have this older vagus. I talked about social engagement system with the newer mammalian vagus, which is part of calming and coordinating even the sympathetics in that hierarchical way. It also coordinates another vagal pathway that goes primarily below the gut, and that's the dorsal vagal system. And what that vagal system is doing, it's telling the gut, do your job, everything is safe, or everything is not safe, and now what does the gut do? You get the diarrhea or constipation.
Yeah.
You get irritable bowel syndrome.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so when I think I've heard you say when the vagal brake comes off, the sympathetic arousal goes up, let's just say in a threat situation. And then three other systems get turned off.
Well, let's do a little nuancing on this. The vagal brake is really, it's like a governor on a motor. So it's like if you were driving your car with your brake on, or like riding your brake.
Yeah.
So the vagus, this newer mammalian vagus, acts as a brake. It slows the heart up. But what that
Wait, slows the heart down or slows the heart up? You said slows the heart up.
Excuse me, slows the heart down.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, what that enables you to raise the heart rate without requesting or requiring sympathetic innervation. So I just take the brake off. I don't have to step on the gas.
Mm-hmm.
So people who
Got
are,
it.
in a sense, very resilient and well regulated, they're doing their moment to moment changes in heart rate to move around, not with the sympathetic excitation, but by moving the brake on and off.
Got it. And
Now,
so the gas then is when we need to mobilize quicker
yes,
to deal with the situation.
right. And with resilient people, once they no longer need to mobilize, the brake goes right back on. They calm down very rapidly.
Yeah. And
But
then
with people with a weak or inefficient vagal brake, when it gets pulled off, it may not come back on.
mm-hmm. And that causes all kinds of problems. So when can you explain, like, I've heard you talk about either it's when the brake comes off, the vagal brake comes off, or when we hit the gas and the sympathetic goes up, that three other systems start to be compromised: the immune function, the reproduction, and I can't remember the other one.
Yeah, well, let's think about when we pull the brake off, we're no longer fighting against the sympathetic, so they can now be expressed rapidly, massively, without being impeded by the vagal brake.
Okay.
So the optimal situations, take the brake off first. If that's not sufficient, the pathway's now clear and efficient, get more gas into the system.
Okay.
Now, the other idea is, what do we call an autonomic nervous system? And this becomes an interesting question. Historically, it's been defined in terms of the organs, but in the brainstem, the areas that regulate the organs through the sympathetic and the vagal pathways, and also through other parasympathetic pathways, are also very much involved with neuroendocrine regulation, immune function. So I like to think of immune and endocrine and visceral organs as part of an expanded autonomic nervous system, because they're coordinated. They're just studied by different groups and diagnosed by different groups, but they're integrated in their neuroanatomy.
Okay. So when we are under stress, just can you walk us through what starts to happen to maybe our gut, some of the other organs when we're under stress?
As long as we keep our social engagement system functioning, the rest of the autonomic nervous system, meaning the sympathetics and the other vagal pathways going above the diaphragm to the heart and below the diaphragm to the gut and the organs, including the reproductive organs, they're doing their job. They're running in a bidirectional homeostatic way. They're regulating the organs. The organs are telling the brainstem, I'm doing okay or not, and this is going through their regulatory dance. Once the social engagement system is off, you now create a possibility of that sympathetic nervous system taking over in terms of a defense of the body. And that will just downregulate the gut and upregulate the heart. So the heart's going to beat faster, the gut's going to turn off. So you now have manifested in behavior. You see this as anxiety, aggression, oppositional behavior, panic. People get mobilized. They're not very present. They don't interact. But what are now the clinical symptoms? Well, they may have palpitations in their heart, but much more interesting is their gut's going to go offline.
Yeah.
So if they have to mobilize, they're just going to stop digestion. So their digestive pathways are basically compromised, and they will start off by being constipated.
Yeah.
And
what about
now,
go ahead.
Then if the fight, flight, and mobilization isn't sufficient to move the organism into a bodily state of safety, and this often occurs with physical size differences, age differences, and the inability to fight or flee. Let's say you're contained and now someone is attacking you and you're strapped up, or even going into surgery or something, right? You can't get out. People, their nervous system may trigger a life threat response.
Yeah.
And the life threat response is now sympathetics turn off. And when the sympathetics were on, they turned off the dorsal vagus. So the dorsal vagus basically just stopped functioning. Your enteric nervous system, the gut nervous system, stopped working. But now in this third stage, the sympathetics stopped working. And now that subdiaphragmatic vagus says, get rid of everything in your system because you're going to be just like a reptile. You're going to have to go underwater and hold your breath. And if you have food in your system, it's going to be metabolically costly, and you won't be able to stand water or hold your breath longer. So the body shuts down, passes out.
So incredible, right? So intelligent, how that functions.
It's intelligent, and in a sense, in many ways, heroic. And the interesting thing with this shutting down response is that we tend to modify it as humans have, that they may have had this massive shutdown response. And then, since it's so potentially lethal, their body may adjust, and now they just dissociate. They just go someplace else.
Yeah.
So they're challenged again. They're gone. They're not there. They're not present.
Right. And then they might blame themselves later, which is the shame response, for blaming their body for not acting and not mobilizing when actually their body had their back.
Absolutely. The body was really trying to do heroic things for them. And it's an interesting message to get out there, and that is that often our lack of fighting or fleeing is really a very powerful adaptive response that has positive consequences. It saves our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the part, and this is really an interesting issue now in contemporary politics and law, people are treated as if when they don't fight or flee, they're treated as if they are co-conspirators or whatever the appropriate word is. They are culpable for what has happened, and they have the blame and shame because they're now being told that if they had fought or run, they would have been obvious. It would have been the other person's fault. Now they can't even go to court. Yeah,
it's so tragic. So the sympathetic, first of all, just to get us clear here, freeze. Is freeze, because freeze has been talked about, as far as I've studied, as both sympathetic and parasympathetic. Can you clarify this for us?
Sure. Freeze is just a bad word. See, whenever we use behavioral phenotype, or even use terms like emotions, which are psychological phenotypes, we may not find the right physiological signature. So freeze means different things to different people. I ask the first question, when you're talking freeze, and tell me about the muscle tone. So if the muscle tone is high, it means there's sympathetic in there. But it may also mean that there is kind of a shutting down or a dissociation, which means it probably has both a dorsal vagus and a sympathetic. But the most profound defense response is the sympathetics are gone and the body just passes out.
Yeah.
Like the mouse in the jaws of a cat. And that doesn't have any sympathetic tone. The limbs are just flaccid.
Yeah. So, but if we have a bystander, like watching a crime, there's been so many studies on this where, like, why don't people act and intervene? They just sort of freeze, right? They're in some sort of freeze response, and then they're called bystanders. Hey, why didn't you do something? But to me, it seems like an immobilization response.
It's a complicated one. So what you're really saying, if we go to Munch's painting, The Scream, where the body's standing up there and the person is trying to scream, but no sound comes out.
Yeah.
We now have, in a sense, these very complex hybrid physiological states that are locking the behavior with muscle tension without an ability to mobilize. I would say, unfortunately, there's not sufficient research to confirm the physiological signature of that response. But the question would be: is how do you conduct that research? How do you create that? How do you get a reliable freeze response? And how, if you do rats, how generalizable will the rat be to the human?
I'm hearing also that dissociation can be both sympathetic or parasympathetic. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think there's an adjustment that goes on, because if it becomes totally a shutdown where the body collapses and the person dissociates, it's potentially lethal. And what probably happens, again, you can learn this through the interviewing of people who have abuse histories, is that may have happened on the initial cases. But the later cases, they just zonked out. They just went someplace else psychologically, and their body was just there.
Yeah.
And that, in a way, is healthier for the body because it didn't put it into those types of risk cases where you just are not getting enough blood oxygen, not getting enough oxygen in the blood, enough oxygenated blood to the brain because the body is just shifting. And that's what pass out. The pumping system just shifts and it can't get the blood up to the brain.
Is depression and sort of low-grade shutdown day in and day out for years, what's that in terms of this parasympathetic, sympathetic?
So again, now rather than using a behavioral phenotype or a psychological phenotype, you did a psychiatric.
Yep. Hey, I'm just trying to make this relevant for the listener here.
Okay, and the part was having spent, I'd say, a couple of decades in medical schools. To me, the greatest shock was what they call depression. Depression is basically stress physiology. You could be anxious and depressed. You could have migraines and be depressed. You could be depressed and not know you're depressed. Yep. So even though we as a culture think we know what depression is, the diagnosis has been used for many. I think the word probably would be more meaningful if we linked it to purpose in life, because that becomes part of the features that we're really talking about. When people lose purpose, we think that they are depressed. And of course, if we understood how to treat people who are depressed, we would never say to them, why are you depressed? You have everything to live for. It's a total misunderstanding of the physiological state they're in. So the point I'm saying is that it's very possible that the type of depression that you're talking about is a depression in which the vagal brake from the social engagement system is just not functioning. It's not there. And that there may be also a downregulation of this ability to use the sympathetic nervous system for mobilization that is not solely defense, meaning play.
Totally.
So again, if we think about people who are depressed, do we ever think of them as being playful?
Right. No.
Or do we think of them as being reciprocal? Do we think of them as picking up on our cues and being mutually supportive? No, we think of them as being removed from. And that's the nervous system that now loses its capacity to co-regulate. So we can start seeing lots of things occurring. I resurrected a method that I developed about 20 years ago, and it's a method of what I call measuring vagal efficiency. And what that metric really measures is how efficient is your vagal brake. So when you take it off, how much heart rate do you get from it? And when it comes back on, how much does the heart rate slow up? So with a very efficient vagal brake, you're basically running your life primarily through manipulating the vagal brake and not recruiting more sympathetic activity.
Okay.
Because
go ahead.
Let me just kind of what we found out was that virtually all we were studying this in adolescents who had gut problems, but they also had other types of measurements, and virtually every type of diagnostic that was run on them, whether it was an autonomic anomaly or a psychiatric one, if they had the problem, their vagal efficiency was lower.
Interesting.
So this gets back to your initial question about depression. I would basically say, if we were able to measure systematically people's vagal efficiency, they would fall into different vulnerable clusters, and depression might be one of the comorbid diagnoses.
Yeah, this is cool to get nuance like this, because so often we just label a reaction as fight, flight, or freeze. Yeah. And it seems there's way more subtleties going on, especially when we consider the vagal brake coming off, because that's mildly sympathetic. And then we also say, oh, and then I can have this bigger sympathetic response, but maybe at the same time, I can even have a parasympathetic response. I'm just hearing that there can be like clusters.
Yeah, you have, in a sense, basic systematic reaction. Then you have very complex hybrids that come out in the story.
Yeah.
Let's clarify one point. The pacemaker on our heart is beating about 90 to 100 beats per minute. But most people listening, their heart rate's probably around 70 beats per minute, in that range, 65 to 75. Now, when you pull the brake off, it goes from 70 now to about 100 without a sympathetic excitation. is just the normal pacemaker of the heart. So you can get a lot more cardiac output without getting the sympathetics on just by pulling the brake off. But if the brake is stayed off, the portal for sympathetic influences now is really ramped up. So once the brake is off, if I now get startled, my heart rate really will go up and I won't be able to calm it down. So the first point is our first reaction to any challenge is just removing the brake. Our second reaction is to put the sympathetics on.
Yep.
But once we take the brake off, we create a vulnerability of the sympathetics and that dorsal vagus to be recruited in defense. And once that they're vulnerable to be recruited in defense, they're not doing their job to support our homeostasis.
Yeah.
So once the social engagement system is pulled off, we now are vulnerable to all those atypical organ anomalies that are often viewed as comorbid with mental health issues.
Yeah. Wow. So wild. So exercise is, let's say I'm in a good place and I'm playing, my heart rate goes up. That's just the brake is actually off there and I'm exercising now, but the sympathetic is being used for play and exercise and taking care of myself.
So I was on the elliptical this morning, and so when my heart rate is initially you're on there, you're going through your warm up, heart rate might be maybe 90 beats per minute. It's not getting the sympathetics on there yet. But as I start really working, another 10 minutes on it, I'm up to like 100, 135 beats per minute. That's recruiting the sympathetics.
Okay.
Now, the interesting part for me is to watch how long does it take for it to come back down.
Uh-huh.
And that's really saying when is the body sending cues that it's safe enough to give up being defensive? So when is your body comfortable calming down?
Wow. Cool. I got one or two more questions here for you and then we'll wrap up. You said something in another interview I heard that I thought was really great. Taking care of people, because there's a lot of listeners here that might be taking care of a partner who's an addict or who is depressed, or taking care of a parent who's aging. And you said something about like unidirectional care giving, and why some people burn out on their sort of childhood habit of taking care of others because they're finally burning out on it's not coming back. Will you say something about that in terms of the affect and how that caretaking unfolds?
Well, when you start thinking about the word caregiver, it is unidirectional.
Yeah.
And people talk, and even when we use the word social support, we view it as unidirectional. But the burnout is when you're not getting reciprocity back. You're not getting the smile back. You're not getting a sense and appreciation. And this becomes really interesting because let's move into the world of HIV.
Okay.
And the world of autistic adults.
Yeah.
In both those situations, caregivers say, I've had enough.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're saying is, in both cases, they feel that the person they're taking care of is only concerned about themselves and not about the caregiver at all.
Mm-hmm.
And what they're really telling you is that the face of the HIV person or the face of the autism one isn't giving you the cues. They're not smiling back, there's not engagement, and the voices aren't working. Now, I say this about HIV as well because the AIDS virus is selective to the facial nerve. It's neurotoxic to the facial nerve. And so in my talks, I show faces of HIV people, and their faces are totally flat, especially around the upper part of the face. So the point is the cues that we are using in our interactions affect the caregiver as well. So there's another metaphor on this, and this is kind of a one I play with it. It's easy to be a good host. It's not so easy to be a good guest.
Uh-huh.
And it has a lot to do with how our cultural expectations of taking care of ourselves, even when we're visitors in other places, we don't really want people to do things for us. Yet, a lot of people want to be compassionate, want to give, and somehow we have to be more educated to understand the level of the interaction, the importance of the reciprocal interaction in giving and receiving, not taking and receiving. And because there's a reciprocity in that action that has both ruptures and repairs just like other relationships.
Yeah.
But when I was talking about HIV and autism, the repairs may be more limited because of the capacity of that other individual's space to give you the cues. They share their voice. And I think we need to be educated and sensitive that we may not be getting what our body is really reaching for. And that is the facial expression and the intonation.
Yeah, that's right. And so for the listener, if you find yourself in this kind of one-way caregiving of a partner, for example, you're probably going to burn out, right, at some point, because if it's not coming back to you, the signals aren't coming back, then, and that would be appropriate. I just want to sort of normalize that if you feel resentful or like burnt out, that makes sense.
Yeah, well, the resentful and the burning out is the physiological consequence of your body feeling like it's biological rudeness. Your body's said enough, it can't take this level of abuse. Now, how do you deal with that is really the next level question. And probably through rotations or other family members or other help, in a sense, self-care and co-regulating for the caregiver.
Yeah.
So you, in a sense, an acknowledgement that you're not going to get the co-regulation from the person you're taking care of. You need other resources for that.
Yeah. One of my mentors calls that an external regulator. So you've got someone else regulating you so that you can help someone else, right?
That's a wonderful metaphor, and I think it's very accurate.
Cool. Steve, parting words, especially around this kind of facial and body language, anything else that you think would be useful for the listener here?
Well, I think that in terms of relationships, we need to, before we start making our interpretations of what's happened or what's gone wrong or that we need just to stop and remove our own personal need to be right, to be good. We have to be, in a sense, a better observer and saying, it could be this way, but I can now see that my body reacted. And if we can just put a break on ourselves for a moment, take that breath, think about it, I think we can do a lot more repairs because, as I said earlier, there's no such thing as a successful argument. Arguing about something that you want to repair is just not going to happen. And the argument is not an argument. It's an expression of the person's feelings. And again, I think that's okay as long as we start to understand that the person's not beating up on someone. The person is expressing their feelings. And when they feel better, they may be more loving and supportive and more capable of repairing.
Yeah. Hugely helpful. Slowing it down, reminding us that we are this mammal in here, right? That it's going to be good for us to slow down and self-reflect that way. Cool. Stephen, where can people find out about you and your work? Because to me, it's endlessly fascinating, and you're always bringing this. And I just want to say thank you for like the pioneering work you've done in our nervous system and with the body and the brain. And it's really eye-opening. It's super enlightening. I think your work is amazing in that way, helping us understand human beings better. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And in a sense, it's a personal journey. The other kind of metaphor I play with is that we're all in search of the manual of what it is to be a human.
Yeah.
Big theory is a reasonable structure to start with. It's not the complete manual, but it gives a structure for us to start putting things into the manual.
Yeah.
What our body is really asking for. And for me, it's been just kind of a remarkable journey. I've really enjoyed it. And I've enjoyed this latter part of it, the ability to take the ideas and to reach out into the community, into different professions, and learn from them and start seeing the applications. So if people want more information, I do have a webpage, and it's been updated. It's much, it's more user-friendly.
Okay.
.com, so they can look up that, and there are things that they can get from there, including some articles and bibliographies and links to other talks.
Great. And it's Stephen with a PH, is that right?
Right.
Okay. And Porges with one S. We'll put that in the show notes so everybody's clear, because I've misspelled it 20 times, I think, before I got it right.
That's right. some places it has had a Z in some countries.
Oh, interesting.
I think they may derail this. I'm not quite sure, but who knows?
Yeah. Oh, I have one more question. I think I asked you this last time, which is, let's say I was talking to 1,000 high school students just about relationships and love, because we're not often educated about connection in schools. What would you want me to say to them? Parting words here.
Oh, I would say that have them think about how their body feels with another person. How does it feel? Does it feel safe? Allow them to start thinking along this continuum of accessibility and vulnerability and how they feel, and then they start making their decisions based on multiple parameters. So you may feel safe with the person, but you may have another narrative about the person not. And so you want to take those feelings and look for the intersect between your cognitions and your bodily feelings. So we're a complex integrated self. But when you talk to young people, they tend not to want to listen to what their body is saying. They want to take a narrative that is being given to them by family or schools or other institutions or social media. And they have to take that narrative and say, how does it fit their own bodily feelings?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do they feel safe enough to be who they really are? So let me give you the final metaphor is that if we assume that the core of humanity, of human beings, is really quite wonderful and supportive and connected, which it is, and that we're merely wrapped in a defensive structure, we have to ask ourselves, when do we give up the wrapper?
Yeah.
And that becomes part of the dialogue. And if we enter into it earlier, we'll make fewer mistakes in terms of our social behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thanks for that metaphor, leaving us with. Cool. Thanks, Dr. Porges. Good to see you again.
Good to see you.
Okay, your action step this week is this. Other than going to Stephen Porges' website, and holy shit, his new website, so different than his old, he had like a website from like the 80s. It was so bad before. No offense, Steve, but I think he knew that. It's just funny to go to someone's website. I mean, I look at my old website from like whatever it was, 2014, and it's like terrible. My Jason Gaddis website. So we're updating that. Yeah, it's just right. We visually look at things and we know if something is like completely bogus or out of date. And anyway, it's awesome. So go check him out. StephenPorges.com, and it's PH in Stephen, STEPHEN, Porges, PORGES.com. Great. Check him out. And listen to the other podcast interview with him. It's good. And he's got a lot of amazing YouTube videos and interviews if you kind of want to geek out on him for a while. I've listened to a lot. All right, your action step is this. So Steve gave a couple good pieces of advice there in the interview. And I would say it's like take a breath, yes, if you can remember. That's huge, actually. If you can remember to take a breath, it's like enormous. And one of the next steps, or one of the steps as soon as possible, is to take responsibility for your sensitivity about reading your partner's face or misreading it. And just say, honey, I'm reading your face, or maybe I'm misreading your face as angry at me. Just own that. Because rather than say, you seem angry, you seem mad at me, you seem whatever, which puts most people on the defensive. A little lighter step is to just say, I'm misreading your facial expressions. Can I check it out with you? Are you, I'm reading some dissatisfaction. I'm reading that you're not available right now. And I just, rather than kind of be over here figuring that out, I'd rather just ask you. See how I just took responsibility there? It's one way. And this is going to be more true for the waves, you more anxious, ambivalent, attached people. Sometimes the island types are also misreading, but are less tracking. They're just not noticing your face as much, right? So this is more for the wavy types like me, historically. Okay, cool. And then again, we are approaching, maybe by the time this podcast comes out, the early bird deadline will be over for the Relationship School's Deeper course. that's okay. You can still get in to this course, although we're filling up rapidly now that the time is approaching. People are like getting more and more serious. Go to relationshipschool.com/DPIR if you want to watch tons of testimonial videos and if you want to apply to get an interview with Steve or Warren. Okay. All right. Again, thanks again for listening. Thanks again for giving a shit about relationships and connection. And we'll see you next time. Hey, thanks so much for listening. Relationship School fans and Smart Couple listeners, please subscribe to this YouTube channel, all right? Do us a favor, subscribe, share one of these videos with a friend, all right? We want to help the planet get their act together around relationships, and you are one of them, so thank you.